Welcome to episode 1 of the Bozi Breakdown. Today we're discussing how former Navy SEAL is making pit stops faster, digging into the details of the Jesse Love disqualification at Rockingham, and looking at Bristol and why it might not have been as bad as you imagined, along with some previews of what to expect on pit lane at Talladega as we get some pit crew shuffles. This is the first episode of a new project where I attempt to take some of my social commentary and expand it into audio and video form. You'll be able to find this on my YouTube channel along with various podcast platforms. Now let's get into Rockingham. That race put on a great show. The stands were packed and there was a lot of action and excitement. But unfortunately, a few hours after the race, we found out that Jesse Love had been disqualified from his win due to a rear suspension issue. The basics of the disqualification are that NASCAR wants the rear axle assembly and truck arm to be closely coupled. That means that they want everything to be tight. The teams, on the other hand, would like that to be a little more loose. So NASCAR measures how the truck arm and the rear axle assembly are stacked together along with some shims that go in between to set the angle. Unfortunately for that number 2 car, there was enough of a gap where NASCAR deemed it outside of the rules and disqualified them. The reason that those shims and that gap exists is the shims allowed the rear axle to be set at different angles to make sure that the rear axle assembly can be lined up with the front of the car and make sure that the pinion angle, which is the angle at the front of the rear axle assembly, is at a proper angle with the drive shaft itself. What teams discovered over the years is that they could leave that section a little bit loose, and that allows the rear end to flex and create some skew. And the benefit to creating some flexibility and movement in the rear end is that it will help the car turn better and it will create for a better aerodynamic situation. The easiest way to explain it is as a car is going into a turn, if it's loose, you can lose control. But if you can make the rear end move around, you can have a loose car and the way it flexes will allow for some side force to be created on the right rear. So instead of the rear of the car spinning out towards the wall, what you end up having is you have a car that can perform as long as you have a driver that can take care of it, and the aerodynamic forces help push the rear end of the car back down the track so it doesn't spin out while having all that speed. The number 2 team has chosen to appeal this, and I can see why. Because there's a possibility that there was something that happened that they could prove and say, hey, this was unexpected, especially because it's a track they haven't been to in a while. So I would say, based on my judgment, that they have maybe some chance, maybe 40% chance of getting their appeal approved, just on the basis of so many components being connected together and the way those pieces are checked. Typically, when a car is on the ground, you're not going to see a gap there, but when it gets put on jack stands in something like post-race teardown, the truck arms can twist a bit and open up a gap. Now, that's not typically a reason to get an appeal, but there are so many pieces connected that they might be able to convince the appeal board to say, hey, this was unintended. My guess is the number 2 team, just like many other teams, pushes things to the edge as far as possible, and because they haven't been to this track in a while in this configuration with these tires, they might have just crossed the line slightly over what they usually push it to. The typical arrangement for teams to try to get as much as possible out of that left rear is to under torque the U-bolt that holds all those pieces together. So let's say that, I think it's a 3/4 inch U-bolt. Let's say something like that's typically 70 or 80 pound-feet of torque that you need to have on it to be considered fully torqued. But if you torque it to 30 or 40 or 50, then you can leave just enough of a gap for it to be able to open up on track, but close once the car is stationary. So it'll be interesting to follow this appeal and find out what they present and if it goes their way, because that'll be big for them to be able to gain those points. Another thing that I noticed at Rockingham is the performance of Harrison Burton in that number 25 AM racing car. And I think a huge part of it is obviously his skill set in an Xfinity type of car versus a Cup car, but another component that I think a lot of people may not be aware of is his pit crew. So AM Racing leases a pit crew from PDG, which is the Pit Crew Development Group, which is a joint organization between 2311 and Legacy Motor Club. So the development crew members at 2311 and LMC all kind of participate together in this joint organization and train, and in order to get them some reps, they are released out to various teams. And in the Xfinity series, they've spent all season with Harrison Burton. And if you watch the Rockingham race, you'll see on most of the pit cycles, Harrison is coming out of pit lane, gaining 2, 3, 4. I think at one point he might have gained 5 spots on a stop, which all of those things play together and show us just how significant the team aspect of the sport is, because not only is Harrison performing, but now you have this crew that's performing, and that just feeds each other. And with good finishes from Harrison, they get to qualify in a good spot, and that brings them further forward. One of the key members of that pit crew is a jackman named Damian Jackson. So Damian Jackson joined 2311 Racing last year as a development pit crew member for the PDG department, but Damian is also a former Navy SEAL and a former college football player. As a former Navy SEAL, he knows a lot about body mechanics, and from what I've learned, Damian has been a huge asset to 2311 and to that PDG program. And one of the things I learned recently, according to some chatter on pit lane, is that the trick move with the jack behind the back that we've seen from 2311 and Joe Gibbs Racing was brought to NASCAR from Damian. So it's kind of cool to see that even though pit stops have been developed for so many years, we now have a former Navy SEAL developing jack movements that are all the rage on pit lane and creating faster and faster pit stops for everybody. My understanding of the timeline is at some point last fall, Damian noticed some of the movements and suggested that maybe they should try this two-handed handoff behind the back with the jack. 2311 started developing that during the off-season, and at some point during the off-season, the move made its way from 2311 to Joe Gibbs Racing. Obviously unintentionally, but Joe Gibbs Racing had enough time to learn it, so when the season started, they were both doing the move to great effect and to great speed. Once things started rolling, we learned that Joël Boignon was kind of the best at it. So that's why there's been a lot of discussions with him. I mentioned him on Action of the Tremendal a few weeks ago after Martinsville, just due to his great performance. But it's important to note that this was developed at 2311, then eventually made its way to Joe Gibbs Racing. And it really should be credited to this development crew member who just had a great eye for some of the body movements and some of the actions needed to make a pit stop effective from a jack transition. And that's really where you're going to get most of your time, is from that transition, because the tire changers are kind of tapped out on their motion with the wheel guns, and the movement across the car is where you're gaining seconds or half a second, as we've seen all throughout this year. The behind the jack move isn't completely new, as dozens and dozens of people on social media have sent me video clips of Junior Johnson swinging a jack around the car. So I want to make that aware before the comments fill up of, hey, you don't know anything, you don't know about the history. I know that Junior Johnson swung a jack at an official and probably some other things. So just like with anything else in sports, there's similarities with moves, but they get improved over time. The first revolutionary kind of jack movement in recent years that's happened came from Kellen Mills, who is a jackman at Legacy Motor Club right now, but he was at Joe Gibbs Racing at the time. So previously, as a jackman made a move, they would typically step over to the left, grab the jack, and then run around the car. Well, around 4 or 5 years ago, Kellen learned that he could use his left hand to drop the jack and then turn a little bit and run around the car. So that was kind of the first recent big move to save a little time. A couple of years later, Eric Ludwig at Hendrick Motorsports figured out that, hey, he could do that step back, but in addition to that, he could grab the jack with one hand behind his back and then run around the car. So that was another incremental time savings. And then that move from Eric moved over to Cody French, who's another Hendrick Motorsports jackman, and they were both assigned to Spire, but recently Ludwig, along with the rest of the crew that was on the number 7 at Spire, was swapped with the number 5 crew at Hendrick. As that developed, a couple of the other Hendrick jackmen picked up the move, but that was kind of the extent of it until we saw this most recent iteration from 2311, where Damian and then all the other jackmen at 2311 and eventually Joe Gibbs Racing and eventually Legacy Motor Club, what they ended up figuring out is that they could do something similar to Ludwig, but instead of stepping back, what they're doing is they're grabbing the jack behind them with their left hand and then throwing the jack behind their back to their right hand, which allows the jack to swing and close on the way around. So what we've ended up here is basically half of the move that Kellen Mills did a few years ago and half of the move that Eric Ludwig did a few years ago, optimized to now sometimes save 5 or 6 tenths of a second, which on a pit stop these days is almost, forever, because everything now is within a tenth or two when you're racing out of pit lane. Speaking of those 2311 pit crews, one of the members of the 23 pit crew, which has been ranked first for most of the year this year, Austin Dickey, is out on medical leave. So what they're going to do is they've pulled Hunter Masling from the PDG crew, which he works with Damien on that 25, along with some of the other teams they've been leased out to, for a few weeks while Dickey recovers. But he should be back, I believe, in a few weeks. So we'll see a slightly different pit crew at Talladega, just like we saw a slightly different pit crew at Bristol for that number 23. The other move that's kind of been a big deal this week is that Skip Flores has been moved from the number 12 of Ryan Blaney to the number 38 of Zane Smith. And in pit crew world, this can be seen as a step down because you have a championship contender versus kind of a developing driver. And he's been moved from a house car to a lease car. And in his place is Keaston France, who was previously on the 38, who is now on the number 12 in place of Flores. So my thoughts on this is, when I first saw this, is that I was generally surprised because I understand that the number 12 pit crew has had some issues this year, but I didn't really see it as focused on the front tire changer, at least from my analysis of onboard video plus stuff that I'd seen in person at the track. It seemed to me that there were a lot of kind of small issues that have stacked up over time. And it especially surprised me to see it happen after Bristol, because the number 12 pit crew was averaging the fastest times, for what I could see, of all the main Penske pit crews. And it seemed like they were having a good day. They had one of their fastest stops that I've seen in recent time. So it all seemed a bit puzzling. And I don't understand really why the change happened, but my guess is that they wanted to try something new just because there had been so many troubles. And it could have been instigated just by individual things that happened during the race. I know at one point in the race, the number 12 pit crew had lost a couple of spots while the number 38 pit crew had gained a few spots. And from a pit crew coach's perspective, if they're looking at a leased crew versus a house crew, they don't really want to see that. So that could have impacted it. The other piece is that Blaney had a great car at Bristol, but unfortunately he lost places on pit lane multiple times. And that is not something I would necessarily blame on the consistency of the number 12 pit crew. I would really gear it more towards the speed of some of the other pit crews. So as we talked earlier in this episode about some of the advancements that 2311 and Joe Gibbs Racing have made, that has helped them on pit lane. So during early stops in the race, we could see somebody like Gibbs or Briscoe making up spots while Blaney was losing spots. And that didn't necessarily mean that the number 12 pit crew was doing something bad. It just meant that the number 54 pit crew and the number 19 pit crews were doing it just slightly better. And I think that's part of it. So I'm interested to see now the dynamics of how things play out, because Keaston has kind of been in the footsteps of Skip. So Skip's been around for a whole lot of time. He has a lot of experience. He's won championships in multiple series. And Keaston kind of slotted into the number 2 when Flores was moved over to the number 12, and now the same kind of situation is happening again. But they have also been rotated back and forth. So I'm curious to see if things change for the number 12 pit crew and how long they keep this, or if we see some other shuffles, or if we see maybe a switch back. So that'll be interesting to follow. But that also brings me to my next point of Bristol and the fact that it really wasn't as bad as social media made it out to seem. So right after Bristol, I caught up on some of the action, and I was looking at it, and the sentiment online was everything is terrible, the car is terrible, nobody can pass. And in reality, a lot of it was just because people didn't like that one car dominated the race. When you look at it from a perspective of the entire race and what was happening, there was actually a lot of action. And one of the things I looked at is the top 10 starters versus the top 10 finishers. In the Cup race, there were 75 positional changes among those top 10. In the Xfinity race, there were only 45. So while the leader in both races was pretty dominant, people just seemed to like what they saw in the Xfinity race. And my first reaction is that a lot of it's about perception. So the way that the Xfinity race was presented compared to maybe the way the Cup race was presented was a little bit different. So people didn't really like what they saw in the Cup race. But from my perspective, watching the broadcast plus watching the onboard and some of the data, I saw some really compelling storylines. And what was really interesting for me, as an example, is watching Ross Chastain just continue to make moves and gain positions every pit cycle, every time he was out on track. And what that ended up doing is creating this huge gap from start to finish, from where Ross Chastain started at the beginning of the race, with him making up ground on track, plus his pit crew helping him make up some spots on pit lane. By the end of the race, he had ended up gaining 28 spots. And we had a similar story for William Byron, where he started the race pretty far back, made up some spots on track, came into pit lane, gained a spot on the first cycle. I think on the second cycle, he gained like 5 spots, and it basically continued throughout the end of the race. So there are these interesting storylines that I didn't really see presented well on TV. So I think that's part of the equation. And I wouldn't necessarily just blame it all on the design of the car. The obvious thing we can see is that, from first to 32nd, there's not a big time gap. And as somebody that enjoys tire fall off, I would love to see a big gap. I would love to see a couple of seconds of time, between somebody on new tires and old tires. But unfortunately, it's just not possible to have a natural kind of barn burner type of race every weekend. So that's kind of my perspective on that. And the other piece of it is that I understand, fans calling for all these changes to the car and all this other stuff. And the limited testing schedule right now doesn't really permit a lot of that. But what I can say is that NASCAR is throwing ideas out to the teams. And one of the rumors I heard is that a few weeks ago, NASCAR kind of floated the idea of, hey, do you guys want to do a run what you brung race at North Wilkesboro for All-Star? But unfortunately, teams weren't up to it. So there was some back and forth and some internal discussions based on the rumors I've heard. And NASCAR basically made an offer to teams of like, hey, maybe we just do a safety inspection and let you run whatever combination of suspension and aero you want to see if we can create an interesting event. But from the feedback I've heard, a lot of the team owners didn't want to go down that path because some probably felt that it could open up a Pandora's box of different things. Some probably didn't want to go to the expense of doing all the simulation work to figure out what was fastest. So that idea unfortunately got squashed. So when we talk about this car, I always try to take a pragmatic look at it because I know that there are a lot of outspoken leaders in the sport that want change, but we also have to consider that a lot of the people that control what happens with the cars may not necessarily be on the same page because they're trying to make things fit within a certain budget. Going back to the Cup cars, it was really nice, I'm sure, for a lot of people to have the weekend off in the Cup Series before 28 weeks straight of racing. But one important thing to know is that a lot of pit crew members didn't get that weekend off. So many pit crew members in the Cup Series from multiple organizations, Pit, Xfinity, and Trucks in addition to Cup. So a lot of them were actually working at Rockingham this weekend, maybe working both races. So that's just the nature of how some of these organizations are set up. And it's something important to consider when we judge pit crew members and their performance and anything else that happens on pit lane, because a lot of these crew members are really hustling almost every weekend from start of the season to the end of the season. Fortunately, most teams will find a way to give them a break at some point, but just something else to consider when people online are like, hey, you had a weekend off, you should just do this or that. No, there's a good chunk of Cup pit crew members that worked last weekend at Rockingham, and many of them enjoyed it because it was a new challenge and a new adventure. And a couple that immediately come to mind are Cody French and Jarius Moorhead, who were on that 48 Xfinity car at Rockingham.
So they are, young, fast guys that really want to be out there and get as much as they can out of it. And they came to mind because today I saw that the Garage 56 documentary is finally coming out. So that's going to be titled American Thunder, NASCAR to Le Mans. And from what I understand, that's going to premiere on Prime Video on June 12th. And I'm really excited to see that because Jarius and Cody, along with a handful of other Hendrick, really development pit crew members at the time, got to go to Le Mans and try something completely different and race in a 24-hour race. And they also competed in the Pit Crew Challenge where they just completely swept the field and did it with manual jacks where everybody else was using air jacks. So it'll be cool to see that documentary out, and it'll be interesting to see how Prime presents the NASCAR races they'll be doing in addition to this documentary. So I'm excited to check that out. I'll be following along at Talladega this weekend. I'm going to be figuring this out as I go along. So my goal is to do this once a week. I may do it a little more frequently. I may try to do some stuff during race weekends if I can. But for now, this will be the first episode of the Bozi Breakdown. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel. Leave comments down there for questions you might have, for things that I can answer in the future or things you'd like to see me cover. This will be on all your favorite podcast platforms, so please rate and review it so we can get some visibility, and I'll talk to you guys soon.